So this is a presentation that's derived from my presentation on visual observers, but I think it's a good lesson to have, especially for this group of new pilots. So instead of thinking of this in terms of how to be a good visual observer, you might also think about this in terms of how to learn about crew resource management. How do you effectively work out there as a team? Now, on yesterday, I talked about one of the biggest safety practices, best safety practices that you can have is to always bring a friend out there in the field with you to deal with all sorts of interesting scenarios, right? Sometimes you just need an extra pair of hands. Sometimes you need someone to call 911 because you're incapacitated. Sometimes you need to bring 4 or 5 undergraduate students to wrangle cows so that they don't eat your equipment out there. All true stories. But when you bring your friend out into the field, it's good to have a friend out there with you, but if they don't know what they're doing, they're not really going to be that helpful, right? That's one of the challenges is, yeah, you want to bring your friend out there, but if they don't know what they're doing, I mean, are they really going to be an effective visual observer for you? That's what today's afternoon presentation is about. It's going to help you learn how to prepare your friends as your visual observers, as well as learn some tips and tricks about crew resource management. We'll go ahead and get started. So if you're a remote pilot in command, why do you need to even learn about being a visual observer? Well, pilot skills are always going to be very different from visual observer skills. And most importantly, you can't really teach your visual observer, your friend, how to be a good visual observer if you don't know how to be one to begin with. And good crew resource management means that you know how to best utilize your visual observer. So what does it mean to be a visual observer? Well, we might think of our visual observers as just our pilot's helper out there, but it does have a legal terminology. Per the regulatory statute 107.33, the visual observer is someone who's used in the aircraft operation that is part of the crew that is must maintain effective communication with each other at all times, must ensure that the visual observer is able to see the unmanned aircraft is within the visual line of sight of the unmanned aircraft, and has 2 very specific roles. They must be able to coordinate to scan the airspace of where the drone is operating and help maintain awareness of the drone with direct visual observation. Again, we're throwing in that direct visual observation in there. It doesn't allow for the use of binoculars, no other vision aids as part of this visual observer definition. So you may have a friend out there with binoculars, but he's not really acting as your visual observer because he's not really helping you. One of those pitfalls that, you think that you've got your friend out there who's going to be helping you, but in reality, it's like throwing a carpet over a hole in the ground. You're just covering up a potential hazard rather than actually solving the issue of there being a hole in the ground. Now that's the legal definition. That sets our baseline standard for what we want our visual observer to do. To scan the airspace and to make sure that the visual observer can be effective in maintaining situational awareness of the drone. But in practice, we also ask our friends and visual observers to do a lot more than just that. So some of the things that we end up asking our visual observer to do, especially, the first rule or first role is watching for intruding air hazards, always looking for incoming planes and helicopters. That's the biggest rule. But then we throw in these additional 5 or 6 roles. Watching for intruding ground hazards, pedestrians, vehicles, bicycles, animals. Watching the drone for abnormal behaviors, whether the drone's going to start to spin out of control or not. Helping to prevent the pilot from being distracted by spectators or bystanders. And then also just assisting the pilot in navigating around obstacles, right? Trying to help the pilot navigate around a pole, around a tree, making sure that we don't hit that tree or object, or trying to get things aligned just into the right position. And then finally, our visual observer, we're going to start yelling at them in case there's an emergency, right? Our visual observers must be ready to assist in an emergency situation. So this becomes a lot of responsibility, right? So when we ask our friends to, hey, come join me out in the field, there's a lot of responsibilities that we're throwing upon them. We have to be very cognizant of all of those whenever we do so. And this is especially important. The pilot's primary responsibility is to make sure the drone is going to be flying safely. But for anyone who's ever tried to fly along the beach, any sort of urban area, any sort of crowded airspace area, there's going to be way too many things happening all at once, and always at the wrong time, for the pilot to really monitor everything adequately at all times. That's because it's really important. That's why it's really important that we do bring our helpers out into the field with us. So what makes a good visual observer? It's always good to bring your friend, but there are some good traits that you might want to trim down that friend list when you ask them to be your visual observer. So you always want to make sure that you find someone who's an effective communicator, one who isn't going to be talking for an hour when all they needed was 3 words. You're going to want to bring your friend who's always good at thinking ahead, anticipating what's going to happen next and what needs to be done. Bring your friend who knows how to get their hands dirty, who isn't afraid to take action, and doesn't wait to be micromanaged. Bring a friend who's good at being a buffer, being a good wingman, right? Help stave off disturbances and onlookers. And then you're also going to want to bring that friend that's good at being focused, right? Not someone who's looking at their phone half the time, right? You want to bring the reliable friend, the one who's really good at being focused and on task. You want to bring your friend who's good at helping you be prepared at all times, making sure that the equipment's ready and always looking professional as you're out there. Then also bringing someone who's good at seeing the overall big picture, how to complete a big mission goal rather than getting stuck in the individual minutia of every task. So these are some big important traits that you're going to have to think about when you ask your friend to join you in the field. Is your friend someone that can do all of these different activities? Now remember, there's 4 major phases to our drone operation. We have our pre-flight briefing. We're going to have to do some pre-flight checklists. We need to make sure that we're good at active communication during the flight missions, as well as handling and helping with post-flight cleanup. So we're going to talk about the different VO actions that we're going to expect out of our visual observers and our pilots to do during each of these major phases. So a pre-flight crew briefing. A pre-flight crew briefing is going to be one of the most important things that you can do before you start your drone operation. A good crew briefing will let the entire crew know what their roles and responsibilities are, any pertinent information for their role, what abnormal conditions to look for, and what to do if there's an emergency. All of those different emergency procedures. As a VO, or even as a remote pilot in command, if you don't know the answers to all of these, the pre-flight crew briefing is the time to get clarity. Don't start a mission until you're ready, or your entire crew is ready. So how do you do a good pre-flight briefing? Well, there's a lot of stuff to cover. There's always a lot of stuff to cover and a lot of things to think about. So up here on the screen, I've got a variety, or rather, one very long template of many of the things that you'll want to discuss during your pre-flight crew briefing. This is going to be all sorts of information. What type of flight that we're doing? Is this a practice flight, or a full maintenance, or a full mission, or a maintenance mission? How well has the drone been acting? Is this a recently refurbished drone? Did we do some fixes on it recently, or is it in good working condition? Let's make sure that also everyone and on our crew knows what their role is. You'll have your remote pilot in command, you'll have your visual observer, but you may also have some other people on your team, your assistants for launch and recovery, your ground crew containment personnel, maybe even assign a specific person just to deal with cattle wrangling. I bring up cattle wrangling a lot because, well, one of my primary drone sites is in the field you see in my background, and we let our cows graze out there. Whenever we do drone flying, we have very curious cows. You don't have to have a visual observer, but as a 107 pilot, it is your role and responsibility to make that assessment as whether or not you can do your flight operations without a visual observer. Now, in many cases, and in many industry standards as well, a visual observer may be required. So some of the other things that you might consider as you're doing your pre-flight crew briefing is to give a very good description of your flight operation site. Now, I don't mean we're out there in the middle of the field. I mean, let's really go into the details of what we should be thinking about. What hazards and risks do we need to be thinking about as we fly? What are the boundaries of our flight operations? Do we have any areas of concerns? I might be flying out in an empty field, but nonetheless, there are still going to be areas that I'm going to have to be very considerate about. I'm thinking about some of our nesting bird sites. I'm going to make sure that I have those all marked out ahead of time, and then inform my crew that we need to make sure that we are doubly sure that we're not going to be near them. We may also make sure that we describe where we might expect non-participating persons to interfere, right? If we're operating next to a pedestrian pathway, we should make sure that everyone on that crew is aware and knows who will be responsible for addressing any non-participating interference. We may also include in our pre-flight crew briefing information about the nearby airports or other areas of air traffic concern. Now, even though I tend to do a lot of my flight operations in a rural area, out in the grasslands out here in Merced, I do know that I have a medical helipad nearby, and that one of their primary flight paths from the hills goes right over my fields. So that's one of those key points of information that I always bring up every time I do one of my pre-flight briefings. Even though I'm in the middle of nowhere, I do know that I get an occasional medical helipad or helicopter flying directly overhead. As I share my information about my mission, I want to make sure that I tell and inform everyone what we're actually even doing out there, as well as any secondary goals that we might have for our flight operations. Right? Our major flight operation may be to map out this particular area, but we may also have some secondary goals to identify some specific key parameters, or to make sure that we notice any particular things that might be abnormal while we're out there. I may also describe in detail what our flight path might be. This way, it'll help our crew know what not to expect. If I tell my team that we're going to go up to 150 feet, and then we're going to do a grid-like pattern, and we're going to show, this is the direction that we're going to be going in. And then they know if my drone stops doing that, well, something's up. Now, obviously, we should all be aware of that, but it's a good idea to make sure that our VO is especially aware. I might have my eyes looking at my transmitter, but I want to make sure that my visual observer still has the eyes to see if my drone is doing what we want it to be doing. We may also have to share information about what to do as we come in for a landing. Now, many of our drone operations these days might be with our rotary wings, our multi-rotors. Landing is relatively easy. Right? We just tell our drone, return home. But we may also be flying our fixed wing operations, our fixed wing drones, and sometimes those come in for a landing a little bit faster than we would like, right? So, good idea to make sure that everyone is aware. If we start yelling, it's time for our aircraft to land, everyone knows what they need to do to get into position. During my pre-flight crew briefing, I'll also make sure that we talk about the weather. Now, the weather should be plainly obvious to everyone who's out in the field with us, but as the remote pilot in command, I've also looked up the weather forecast. And I might know, as the pilot in command, that while it's sunny right now, we may have rain incoming in the next hour and a half. That's pertinent information to make sure that we share with our entire flight crew. That gives us a little bit of a deadline to make sure that we get our flight operations done, but it also helps our VO know, hey, I should probably be looking out and monitoring the cloud situation in case that storm comes in a little bit early. During our pre-flight crew briefing is also the time that we're going to have to discuss how we're going to work on our communication within the team, who's going to be the chain of command, who do we talk to in case something particular happens, how do we work with liaisons with other groups who might be in the field with us. Sometimes if I'm doing a drone operation, I'm not the only team out there. Right? We got the drone team out there. We might have some other field researcher teams out there. Who's in charge of that liaison communication? We may also want to discuss who's going to be dealing with people outside of our group, the non-participants, right? Our spectators, our bystanders. Whose role and responsibility will it be to go deal with those to make sure that they don't interfere with the pilot? And then finally, on our pre-flight crew briefing, we're going to want to make sure that we talk about how do we handle all of these emergencies. Right? Yesterday, I mentioned that we should always come up with emergency plans for our 10 most common scenarios. Well, our pre-flight crew briefing is our opportunity to make sure that everybody knows about those plans. What to do. What to do if we have a loss of power. What we're going to do, or when do we make that decision that we need to abort our mission. What do we do if we lose communication, even between ourselves, right? If we've got a remote visual observer out in the field and our radios aren't working, how do we address that? How do we communicate if we have anyone walking into our flight site? Do we start yelling? Do we start screaming, whistling, right? Start flashing lights? We need to make sure that we are all on the same page. Otherwise, we're going to get very confused when things start to happen. And in an emergency situation, right, these are situations that get very confusing very quickly, and they are prone to making mistakes. So our pre-flight crew briefing is our opportunity to make sure that everyone is on the same page, that we all understand what our roles and responsibilities are, and that we all know what we might be needing to look for throughout the flight operations. So that's a lot of information. That's a lot of information. Don't worry, again, these slides will be posted online. You'll all have an opportunity to download these slides. Nothing on this slides is particularly novel or unique or different. These are all very common, basic information. But it's very important to remember that you need to communicate all of this to whoever you bring out to the field with you. So when you bring your friend out to the field with you to act as your visual observer, remember, they need to know all of this information. So there's a lot to take in our pre-flight briefing. Don't, as a visual observer, don't let the pilot start. As a pilot, don't start until your visual observer feels that they're ready. Right? The pre-flight crew briefing is a time for everyone to ask questions, to ask for clarification, ask to walk through all of the steps again. Sometimes it does take more than one or two instructions to remember how to do everything. What's important to remember also as a visual observer, as a visual observer or as a pilot, is that the pilot won't know if the visual observer doesn't know something until they speak up. So as a remote pilot in command, ask your visual observers to check that they understand their roles and responsibilities. So during the flight mission, well, now the real fun begins. Now we're going to have to work at some of those very specific skills and tasks that our visual observer is going to need to do. So we put up these 6 tasks earlier. They need to watch for intruding air hazards. They need to watch for intruding ground hazards. They need to watch the drone for abnormal behaviors. They need to prevent the pilot from being distracted, to assist the pilot with navigation, and to be ready to assist in an emergency. So now we're going to go into each one of these tasks and talk about these in a little bit more specific detail. How do you do all of these 6 tasks? So the hardest one, especially for newcomers, is monitoring for air traffic. Now the good news is most air traffic will not actually be a threat. I would say I put down 99% of air traffic will not be a threat. I would say it's closer to say 99.99%. But it's very important that you and your team are ready for that 0.01% chance. Because when that does happen, when that does occur, those are the things that make headlines, national headlines. Now, most general aviation air traffic will be flying at around 6,000 to 10,000 feet above ground level. Most commercial air traffic will be flying above 25,000 feet. Most other air traffic will be very high and not really a threat to you. but your biggest threats are going to be helicopters. Helicopters, crop dusters, and other survey aircraft. And if you're next to an airport, aircraft on approach or takeoff from nearby airports. Those darn helicopters, they definitely get in the way of a lot of our flight operation. So, how do we monitor for air traffic? So, when scanning for intruding air traffic, always be vigilant, always be alert. Remember, this is why you bring a friend who's very good at being focused and on task. Listen, 9 out of 10 times, you're going to hear an aircraft long before you see it. Now, if you start need to look for an aircraft, always be scanning the horizon first. The horizon is where the most pertinent air traffic threats are going to be coming from. If you don't see anything at the horizon, then start scanning back and forth, increasing a little bit back, a little bit at a time. And once you find the aircraft, then you're going to have to make a threat assessment. You're going to have to judge by the distance, the altitude, and the heading of that aircraft to assess whether or not this aircraft is going to be on a collision course with us. And all throughout this entire process, you must be communicating what you see as well as what you don't see. If you don't see the aircraft, make sure that you say that. Because if I'm the pilot looking in one direction and I hear an aircraft on approach, and I've got my visual observer, his job is to look for that aircraft. If he doesn't see that aircraft, right, I mean, that's something that I should know, I as a pilot should know about. That my visual observer hasn't found the potential incoming threat. And so I should be at a heightened state of being prepared for an emergency abort or other emergency action. So, scanning techniques. When we might look for an aircraft, our first instinct might be to look up. Unfortunately, not all of our drone or intruding aircraft that are going to be a threat are really actually going to be up there. Because usually by the time the aircraft is, say, at a 45 or 60 degree angle above us, it's either way too high or it's about to crash into us. In either case, it's not really going to be helpful to know about it at that point. Instead, what we want to be doing is looking for the aircraft that's coming in at the horizon, because that's where our low altitude aircraft are coming from. So our best scanning technique, we'll want to scan starting at the horizon, starting from either the left or the right. We'll go looking to the left, and we'll go up a little and look back and forth, back and forth, increasing our pitch just a little bit every time. You want to make sure that you're taking sufficient amount of time as you do your scanning. So don't, whip your head back and forth as you scan. Make sure that you're spending an appropriate amount of time as you do your scanning. Again, especially remember your role here is to really look for intruding aircraft. Now, looking for aircraft is a lot harder than it might seem. Now, there are many reasons why trying to spot an aircraft in the sky can be particularly difficult. And here's one of them. This is a condition, empty field myopia. Empty field myopia is a term for when your eyes get tired of looking at nothing. And so your eyes automatically focus on a location immediately in front of you instead of the distance you should be looking at. So you might have an aircraft, if it's in focus, right, you can see it. But if you are just staring at an empty blue sky, where are your eyes going to be focusing? If your eyes get tired, you may not realize that your focus is coming down, and now you're focusing, say, only 10 or 20 feet in front of you, and not at the 1,000 or feet that you need to have your focus at. And if we're looking for little tiny objects in the sky, it's going to make looking for those aircraft incredibly hard. So, how do you combat this? How do you fight this? Keep your eyes stimulated by occasionally looking and focusing on distant visible objects. Don't stare at an empty blue sky. Make sure that you're always looking around, keeping your eyes looking at and focusing on objects that are far away, and then start your scanning. Make sure that your focus is in the right location before you start actually searching. Don't forget that your peripheral vision is very good at detecting motion. So utilize your peripheral vision, look in one direction, but as you're looking at here, use your peripheral vision around to see if you notice any motion in the sky. Now, when is an aircraft a threat? So we've done our scanning, we see an aircraft, now we have to do our threat assessment. We're going to have to determine, is this aircraft actually going to interfere with our operations? So we need to watch the aircraft for a couple of seconds, and we need to assess the heading of the aircraft and the altitude of the aircraft. Easier said than done. There's a couple things working against us. One of them is known as the Blossom effect. Human eyes are really good at identifying fast-moving cross traffic, rather than, unfortunately, the slow-moving traffic that's actually going to be a threat to us. So the Blossom effect is that an aircraft on a collision course with us is going to look stationary in front of us, and it's not really going to be changing size until it's way too late. So here we have a little bit of a diagram. At 1 nautical mile, it's just a speck in the sky. But as it gets closer, we realize that our approximate time to impact is decreasing a little bit too quickly for our likes. Another way to look at that, this is math, really. We are terrible. Humans are just absolutely terrible at judging distance. And objects at a distance will always look small, and it's going to continue. It's going to continue to look small until it gets way too close to us, right? It's just an arctangent function. Math, right? Terrible. But that's what it is. We'll be able to see, we're really good at seeing when things change quickly, when things change in size very quickly. But as our objects are moving at a far distance, that apparent size difference is going to be very minute, very small, and very difficult to detect. So it's almost going to be looking like that object is just not changing in size, and it's just kind of staying in place. But if we were able to measure it, yeah, it's increasing in size just slightly, but that slight increase in size is actually changing its relative distance to us by a significant margin. And so it's very difficult to tell how fast something is moving towards us, especially. So this is why it's very important to always treat everything as a potential threat, even if it looks far away. Because humans, we are just terrible, absolutely terrible at judging speed and distance and size from a significant distance. Judging heading isn't any easier. The good news is there's a couple of tricks we can utilize. An aircraft that looks like it's crossing the horizon very quickly is not likely to be a threat. If we see an aircraft and we can see it flying across the horizon, that means that it's going a different perpendicular direction to the way that we are looking at, right? It's going across. But if there's an aircraft that's on the horizon and it doesn't look like it's moving, or it's moving very slowly, it's actually potentially likely to be a threat. See, if we look at it from our perspective standing on the ground, that aircraft might be looking like it's just moving slightly or just a little bit. But if we had a top-down view, right, it could be that that aircraft is actually flying towards us. And we're just having a terrible time judging that change in relative size to determine whether or not it's flying away from us or towards us. One of those optical illusions that makes it really difficult to fly at a long distance. Judging altitude is our next major challenge. Again, humans, we are just terrible judges of aircraft altitude. We might look up in the sky and see an airplane, and our estimate for how high it is might range between 1,000 feet to who knows how high, right? Unless you knew or have some experience in knowing how high aircraft are flying or how big aircraft typically are, right, it's going to get really difficult. So make sure, again, you always treat everything as a potential threat until you're absolutely certain that it's not going to be a threat. Now, there's going to be a handful of contextual cues that you can utilize. You can try to compare the altitude to towers and buildings. Remember our trigonometry as well, right? Compare it to our cloud layers. If it's leaving contrails, then it's typically not a threat. And then remember, aircraft are generally pretty loud. But it's going to be a challenge, and it really, really is. And that's why we try to avoid flying in heavily air trafficked areas. So, as we're monitoring the air traffic, even if it's not an immediate threat, we may still need to be able to make sure that we can communicate this effectively. And it's always good to have a phrase book, a set of specific phrases to utilize for specific situations. And make sure that everyone on your crew is aware of what these mean. So these are the phrases that I typically use in my flight operations. I would yell pause flight, or proceed, or use all clear, possible aircraft heard, visual contact with aircraft confirmed, threat inbound from a particular direction. Or if the aircraft's not a threat but we all hear it, make sure that I communicate aircraft non-threat. Or again, if we have ground participants or people intruding upon our flight area compromised, right? So I've got a set of specific phrases that I would yell out and I would teach my crew to be aware of as we're doing our flight operations. Again, important to remember, communication is one of those key aspects that will improve our flight safety. So what about the ground hazards? So now that we figured out how to look at the sky, we also need to make sure that we're also monitoring the ground as well. So again, always be vigilant, always be alert, keep your situational awareness up, always know where those potential access points are, where are the walkways, the bicycle paths, and always, again, communicate with the crew as to the entire situation. Best practice, again, to make sure that you place your visual observers at the most concerning access points, to make sure that those sensitive areas, again, are the ones who are going to get the most amount of attention. We may also ask our visual observers to deal with some of our, or to at least help us identify abnormal UAS conditions. So while the pilot's primarily responsible for monitoring the drone at all times, we still may rely on our VOs to help watch our aircraft to look for things to look out for. Things to look out for: wobbly flight, oscillatory motor run-ups, unannounced changes in direction, unanticipated gaining in flight speed, or flames, right? That's one to always keep an eye out for. Sometimes it's useful to have walkie-talkies out in the field with us, But do remember that our walkie-talkies are running off a radio frequency that may interfere with our telemetry or our communication with the drone. So the pilot may not be the one who should have the walkie-talkie, but maybe someone standing next to them to make sure that we don't have any interference on those radio communication lines. So things to look out for as our drone is flying. Obviously, wobbly flight's one of them, right? Most of our modern drones are pretty darn stable. Now, 10, 12 years ago when I was first building drones out of little kits, they were pretty terrible at flying. These days, Mavic 2, yeah, it's pretty darn stable. So when it's doing something funky, when it's wobbling around, now that's something that I want to be alerted to. I might have my eyes looked at my telemetry screen, at my video screen, right? And the gimbal system on the Mavic 2 is really darn good. Everything looks super stabilized, which is really great for video, but it's not telling me that my drone's wobbling out there, which is what I hope my visual observer is going to start yelling at me for. Oscillatory motor run-ups. This one happens every now and then. Sometimes a symptom of a degraded system that our drone is just going to go whoop, 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 right? It sounds like it's revving its motors every couple of seconds. That's often an indication that there's something wrong. Either it's a terrible wind conditions, or maybe we need to tune our stabilization system, or something got a little bit wonked out, or our IMU sensors are starting to degrade. Changes in direction or gaining in speed is also one of those things to keep an eye out. This is why we tell our flight crew to keep an eye out for what we plan on doing. So if our drone if we think that our drone's going to be going left, but our drone starts turning right, my screen, I might be looking at the telemetry. My visual observer should be able to call out and say, hey, it's turning right when it's not supposed to be. Gaining flight speed. This one's a pretty critical one. So a more subtle but similar issue occurs when our drone slowly begins to drift in a direction and then start to gain speed. Now this happens typically in a flyaway situation, typically in a GPS failure situation. It's just gonna and then start flying away real quickly there. The problem is, by the time it's racing off in a direction, it's usually too late to save it. That's why we really want our visual observers to be super alert and attentive. Hopefully they can see, hey, it's starting to drift away. That's a sign that we need to do something about that before it starts racing away. We might be able to save drifting away, but we're never going to be able to save racing away. Next, we really need our visual observers to help us with preventing distractions. All right, this is going to be one of those fun challenges that we're going to have to deal. Our visual observers. It's pretty common to have curious onlookers out there to help. And they just want to see what's going on, right? That's fine. And some of us, we like to talk. I know I like to talk. I talk a lot. Sometimes I talk a little too quickly too, as well. But our visual observers, it's part of their role and responsibility to help us maintain a good operational area to help keep our pilot from being distracted. So make sure our visual observers are willing to step in to stop our onlookers from distracting our pilot in command. You may even start having them yell out things such as a sterile cockpit rule, which is a pretty typical aviation lingo for don't disturb the pilot in sensitive situations, or when flying under or at an altitude less than 1,000 feet. Assisting with flight navigation. Occasionally, the visual observers will be tasked with helping to navigate the drone. And this is fun, right? You can go, we want to get just that right picture, get that that right angle into our situation. But remember that our drones can move in 3 dimensions. Our screen might be pointed in one way, but the nose might be pointed in a different direction. So we're looking this way, but we're flying that way. Or we're looking north, looking left, east, right? it can get a little complicated. So make sure during your pre-flight briefing that everyone has an idea of, say, what left means. When I yell out, I'm moving to the right, does that mean my right, the drone's right, or the visual observer's right? So decide on a coordinate system. Sometimes northeast and down or northeast up isn't the best way to describe orientation. I know at UC Merced, fun fact, UC Merced is not built on a northeast alignment. Everything's at a 45-degree diagonal. So all of our roads are going northeast and southwest. So which way is north? Everyone gets confused, and it's just not useful to use northeast and up. So we say forward, left, right, up. But it doesn't even have to be orthogonal. Sometimes we'll use coordinate systems up towards the tower, away from the tower, towards the pineapple, down the road, right? Anything that you can use that you can all agree on in terms of direction terminology. Ooh, emergency management. Now I know that I'm running low on time. Andy's giving me the look there. So I'll try to speed things up just a couple more slides. I know this is all real important stuff, and definitely I could keep talking about this for many, many hours. So emergency management, obviously, during your pre-flight crew briefing is the time to discuss what do you do in an emergency situation. A typical plan will address how do you maintain visual contact with the aircraft, what do you communicate when these situations occur, what actions the pilot needs to do, and what do we need to do after we have a particular incident, and especially when it comes down to reporting. During an emergency, typically a visual observer might be asked to help clear the flight area, to gather up safety equipment. You might task someone, if there's a fire, it's going to be your role to go grab the fire extinguisher, but it's your role to go grab the shovel. Make sure that everyone knows what their role is. Sometimes you might even need to inform air traffic control. This typically occurs if you're flying in a controlled airspace or a restricted airspace. You better make sure that your visual observer knows how to do that. Post-flight, the good news, most drone flights occur without an incident. And we'd like to keep it that way. So always, after each flight, always inspect the drone for damages. Always properly take care of spent batteries. Once you have your batteries and they're depleted and they're overheating because they're just in that hot aircraft, don't stick them on the charger right away. Let them cool down. Don't stick them into an enclosed bag because they're just going to heat up even more in an enclosed bag. Put them out where they get plenty of airflow, so make sure that they cool down. And make sure that you document everything. Document what went wrong, but it's also a good idea to document what went right, so that you can, say, incorporate that into your standard practices for the future. So being a visual observer, there's actually quite a lot that you're going to have to be aware of. As a pilot in command and as a visual observer, you're going to want to know and make sure that you can handle all of these tasks. So usually, I also remind our visual observers, being a visual observer is an important responsibility, but it's one where your efforts will be appreciated when you are an effective visual observer. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here. I have 2 more talks upcoming on Thursday. I'm going to talk about flight operations in controlled airspace and night operations. Well, I think I've got a handful of questions to answer. So I'll go ahead and get started on some of those. So hopefully this has been informative for you guys so far. Let's see, what do we got here? Specific restrictions flying drones around aircraft? Yes and no and yes. It's a little complicated. So FAA does not deal with wildlife regulations. You will have to identify whichever set of regulations. This might be NOAA, this might be state level, this still might be federal, and it's done typically by species as well. Now, if you're flying in a state park or a national park or a conservation land, the field managers we'll know all of that information about which species are going to be protected and what does it mean for a taking to occur. That might be a bit of a challenge, and it is a bit of a challenge to deal with flying around wildlife. In general, though, please don't. Please don't. There's plenty of evidence of how disruptive drones can be to very sensitive species. Let's see, what else do we have here? Lighting systems available to attach to a drone. There are some lighting systems, and we'll talk about this one more in the night flying training. However, most of these lighting systems are going to be most effective at night. You can put a super bright strobe light on your aircraft during the day, but honestly, it really will not improve your aircraft's visibility. Your drones, again, are pretty small, and I mean, they would have to be extremely bright lights for them to be really effective during the daytime. At night, though, you can definitely get some very effective anti-collision strobe lights out there, visible for 3 to 5 miles out. But during the day, though, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that you can do to improve your aircraft's conspicuousness or being able to be seen. Okay. Let's see. What do you do when you lose control of the drone? Oof. Andy, Sean, would you like to share some of your experiences when that occurs?
When you lose control of your drone, well, start thinking fast if you can. Try to mitigate how much of a problem it's going to be. And I mean, if you're going to crash your drone, crash it softly and then try to find out where it's at. Keep it away from people, of course. You sometimes still have function, or at least partial function of the drone. When, for example, one time my drone tried to fly back to Monterey because that was the last place it was flown at. And so, yeah, I was able to set it down fairly softly, even though it was technically a crash. But yeah. Anyways, we probably should finish up. I know that Pat's got his session too. Maybe everyone, maybe we can just save the questions and we'll come back to this at a later time with post answers. Sound good?
Okay, sounds great. So hopefully this has been a good good session for everyone. And yeah, I'll go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and cede control over back to Andy and our next presenter.
Brandon, did you see there was a question about, is it required by law to have a visual observer, or is it just a recommendation?
So it's not required by law to always have a visual observer. However, it is required by law to make that assessment, do you need a visual observer? And in many cases, and actually in many industry standards, you may be required to have a visual observer. My best recommendation is to always bring a visual observer.
Second that. All right, thank you so much. Yeah, great talk, lots of great information, and little things that it helps to think through systematically and prepare. And probably the best thing you can do in terms of like what happens when you lose control of your drone is to think about that ahead of time. So at least you can practice a couple of scenarios. All right, let's wind down. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. I know we're a little off schedule here, but I think that's okay. So let's all take a break for 10 minutes. We'll come back, and we're hoping that Pat will be able to join us. He's having some technical issues, but we're working through them. So come back in 10 minutes and we'll